The man who won everything and still felt empty. The real story of Leonardo DiCaprio. Picture this. 22 years. 5 nominations. 0 wins. The most recognized face on the entire planet. A man whose films had generated billions of dollars, whose name alone could greenlight a project, whose performances left critics searching for new words to describe what they had just witnessed. And yet, the one institution he desperately wanted to recognize him kept looking the other way, year after year, loss after loss, until the losing itself became more famous than the winning ever could have been. There is something almost mythological about a story like that. A man who had everything the world could offer: wealth, fame, adoration, power, and still felt the hollow ache of one specific door that would not open. But here is the question nobody really stops to ask. What does that kind of pursuit cost a person? What do you give up when you spend 2 decades trying to outrun a version of yourself the world refuses to let go of? What happens inside a man who eats raw liver in a frozen river to prove he is more than a pretty face on a poster? And when he finally, after all that time and sacrifice, hears his name called, why does the victory feel like it arrived too late to fill the hole it was supposed to fix? This is not just a story about awards. This is a story about a boy who made a promise in poverty that shaped every single decision he made for the next 50 years. A boy who grew up on streets that taught him survival before kindness. Who watched his mother break herself in half trying to give him a better life. Who walked into one of the most ruthless industries on earth with nothing but raw talent and a refusal to quit. And who discovered, at the absolute peak of global fame, that winning the whole world is not the same as winning the one thing you actually needed. To understand any of it, you have to go back. All the way back. To the cracked sidewalks. To the 3 buses. To the apartment where a mother and her son figured out how to survive on almost nothing. East Hollywood in the late 1970s was not what the name implied. There was no glamour there, no glitter. The neighborhood near where young Leonardo grew up was defined by drug deals on corners, poverty that wore people down slowly, and the constant sound of sirens cutting through the night. His mother raised him alone, working multiple jobs to keep a roof over their heads, stretching every dollar further than dollars were meant to go. She was his entire world. His mother, his father, his coach, his shield. She took him everywhere on those 3 buses across the city, arriving early to auditions, sitting in waiting rooms full of other families chasing the same distant dream, never once telling him to give up, even when giving up would have been the logical thing to do. His father was present, but at a distance. An artist who lived on the margins, who introduced his son to creative thinking and counterculture, but could not offer the stability a child needs. What Leonardo had instead was his mother's absolute unshakable belief in him. And on the streets outside their apartment, he had an education no classroom could provide. By the time he was 10 years old, he already understood something most adults spend their whole lives avoiding. That life is not fair, that opportunity does not wait for the unprepared, and that if you want something better, you have to fight for it yourself, no matter how frightened you are. He started auditioning at 12. Not because he was pushed by ambitious parents chasing glory through their child, but because his mother wanted to give him options she never had. The early years were humbling in a way that would have crushed a less determined kid. Waiting rooms full of boys who looked just like him, or looked better, or had more connections. Casting directors who barely glanced up. The same phrase, delivered with practiced indifference. We'll be in touch. They never were. Rejection after rejection, collected like stones. A scribbled note from one casting director that would surface years later, describing the young Leonardo DiCaprio as nothing special. But his mother never wavered. Every single time a door closed, she would squeeze his hand and say they don't know what they're missing. We come back tomorrow. And they did. 3 buses. Early arrivals. Late departures. The faith of one woman becoming the armor of one boy. The first real crack in the wall came in the early 1990s. A recurring role on a popular family sitcom that gave him visibility and a steady paycheck. Millions of people saw his face every week. Fan mail started arriving. His name appeared in magazines. But Leonardo felt the box forming around him in real time. The cute television kid. A label that would follow him into auditions and quietly cost him the serious roles he actually wanted. He was grateful. He was also terrified of being trapped. So he kept pushing, kept auditioning for films, kept chasing roles that mattered. And then in 1993, he got one that changed everything. A film set against a backdrop of family dysfunction and abuse, where a teenage Leonardo stood across from one of the greatest actors in the history of cinema and refused to flinch. He was 18 years old. He was terrified. And when the cameras rolled, he did something extraordinary. He stopped acting and started being, pouring the fear of his own childhood, the weight of his mother's sacrifices, the rage at a world that tried to keep them both small, directly into the character. Critics noticed immediately. A revelation was the word one major publication used. Suddenly, the television kid had become something else entirely. That same year, he delivered a second performance that was somehow even more extraordinary. Playing a young man with developmental disabilities opposite one of the most respected actors of his generation, Leonardo disappeared so completely into the role that audiences genuinely forgot they were watching someone perform. Critics were stunned. And then came something he had been chasing since childhood. An Academy Award nomination. Best Supporting Actor. At 19 years old. He did not win. But the nomination was a door kicked open. A signal to the industry that he was not a question mark anymore. He was a contender. And then Titanic happened. And nothing was ever quite the same again. The film was a gamble by every measure. A $200 million production that most of the industry privately expected to be a disaster. The director initially did not want Leonardo for the lead role. "You are too famous, too recognizable, too much of a known quantity," he was told bluntly in their first meeting. But Leonardo fought for the part. He read for it. He refused to walk away from a director as stubborn as himself. And finally, reluctantly, the director said yes. What followed was one of the most seismic events in modern entertainment history. The film did not just succeed. It detonated. It ran in theaters for months. It shattered box office records that had stood for decades. It swept the major awards. And at the center of all of it was a 23-year-old from East Hollywood who had just become the most famous human being on the planet. The numbers were staggering. The cultural impact was impossible to overstate. And Leonardo DiCaprio, standing at the absolute peak of everything he had worked for, had never felt more trapped in his entire life. The fame that followed was not gradual. It was instant and total. He could not walk down a street without being mobbed. He could not eat in a restaurant without cameras appearing. Privacy did not just diminish. It evaporated entirely. And worse than the loss of anonymity was the loss of the thing he cared about most: credibility. The industry that had once taken him seriously after his early dramatic work now saw him only as the face from the ship. Casting directors dismissed him for challenging roles. Critics who had praised him for the performances that mattered now sneered at his more recent success, as if being in the biggest movie ever made was somehow evidence against his talent. He was being offered everything except what he actually wanted: romantic leads, franchise opportunities, projects designed to capitalize on his face and his name. Every offer was a deeper step into the box the industry was desperate to seal around him. And the Academy, the institution that had recognized him with a nomination at 19, responded to the biggest film of the decade with complete silence. No nomination, not even a mention. The message landed clearly: box office success and artistic respect are not the same currency. Not for him. Not yet. If this story is connecting with something in you, if you see something of yourself or someone you love in this kind of relentless, exhausting pursuit, please share it. Because what comes next is the part of this story that most people have never fully understood, and it deserves to be heard. The years that followed Titanic were, by Leonardo's own later admission, defined by fear. He took roles based on anxiety rather than instinct. Trying to prove range, trying to escape the label, sometimes swimming in entirely the wrong direction. A period piece here, a thriller there. Projects that had the right intention but landed in the wrong place. Critics were not kind. The industry began to whisper. Maybe he was just one extraordinary film propped up by a billion-dollar ship. And then salvation arrived in the form of a director whose own career had been defined by being perpetually underestimated by the same institution that was ignoring Leonardo. Their partnership, which began with a brutal historical epic set in 1860s New York, transformed Leonardo from a movie star back into what he had always wanted to be: an actor. The director pushed him past technique, past movie star instinct, past every habit that performing in front of cameras builds up over years. "He broke me down," Leonardo would say later, "and rebuilt me as an actor, not a celebrity." Critics noticed the transformation. The performance was raw and physical and completely devoid of vanity. But the Academy still looked away. No nomination. The snub stung. But what made it more than a disappointment was the pattern it was beginning to reveal. The nominations came eventually. The second one, more than a decade after the first, for a towering performance in which Leonardo embodied a brilliant, mentally unraveling industrialist with such precision and depth that critics ran out of superlatives. Surely this was the year, everyone said. The category was competitive. The nomination was well-deserved. And when another name was called, the silence in Leonardo's corner of the room said everything that needed saying. The third nomination came for a film where he played a morally disintegrating cop living a double life. Emotionally raw, physically depleted, stripped of every comfortable habit. The film he was the beating heart of won the highest honor in cinema. The director finally received the recognition that had been denied him for decades, and Leonardo sat in the audience and applauded for everyone else's triumph, his own contribution somehow invisible in the accounting of a film he had carried on his back. The fourth nomination came for a performance that many critics called the most fearless work of his generation. A character so unhinged, so morally demolished, so completely removed from anything resembling a traditional leading man that it seemed physically impossible to ignore. He did things on screen that no actor at his level of fame would have risked. He committed with a totality that went beyond craft into something closer to obsession. Time called it the best performance of the decade. The awards that preceded the Oscars agreed. Surely, everyone said, finally, this had to be the year.